50,000 men marched directly into the brutal heat of the Egyptian desert. If Herodotus is even close to the truth, it was not a standard military patrol. It was a massive moving city of bronze shields, pack animals, water skins, and intense fear. That is the kind of astronomical number history uses when it wants human imagination to kneel. They were sent west by Cambyses, the king of Persia, just after the Egyptian empire fell. Their absolute final target was not another army. Their target was a religious oracle, not a fortress, not a political border. They were marching to silence a divine voice. The oracle of Amunet Siwa had become significantly more than just a stone shrine. It was a powerful voice in the desert that could bless kings or fatally wound them. Cambyses had conquered Egypt, but bloody military conquest is absolutely not the same as total obedience. So according to the ancient story, he sent 50,000 armed soldiers to break the voice. Ancient kings didn't have spreadsheets, they had egos. The 50,000 figure was propaganda to terrify enemies. But shrinking the number doesn't solve the story. It is still a massive imperial force sent into a lethal desert, and then history completely loses the receipt. Marching from Thebes to Siwa means leaving lush river country for the deep hostile western desert. Out there, physical distance is not measured only in miles or hours of walking. It is measured strictly, brutally, and mathematically in the exact consumption of water. Every single man drinks. Every single pack animal drinks just to survive the punishing heat. Every blazing hour under that relentless sun permanently spends the army's fragile resources down. A column of that staggering size does not simply march. It violently consumes the world in front of it. Food, shade, leather, psychological discipline, military patience, and irreplaceable oceans of water. Herodotus says they successfully reached the first major oasis, rested their exhausted forces, and moved on. That is the absolute last moment. The story still behaves like a standard military operation. After that, it becomes one of the most terrifying disappearances in the entire ancient record. Imagine the last safe producing while slipping permanently out of sight far behind them. There is a special kind of terror in realizing the landscape is no longer just scenery. It is the active enemy, and it does not need to chase you to kill you. It only needs to wait patiently for your logistics to inevitably fail. Picture the massive crawling column from high above the baking earth. The first ranks are already breathing dust by the time the rear finally leaves the camp. Somewhere in the middle, a terrified soldier is constantly counting the remaining skins of water. Somewhere behind him, an officer is aggressively pretending the mathematical count is still enough. That is how great empires actually die in deserts. Not with one highly cinematic scream, they die with arithmetic. The monster is not hiding behind a dune. The monster is cold, relentless subtraction. One day's water rationing becomes half a day. Half a day becomes a loss of discipline. Loss of discipline becomes whispered rumor, and rumor instantly flashes into uncontrollable panic. Herodotus gives us the famous, violent, and highly cinematic ending to the Persian March. The people of Siwa told him a great unnatural wind rose from the deep southern desert. It struck while the massive Persian military force was stopping to eat their midday rations. Then the heavy sand buried them, all of them. Men, bronze weapons, pack animals, military orders, human fear, and the king's brutal command. They were buried so completely that the army never even came close to reaching the oracle. The ancient temple was not destroyed. The priests of Siwa survived entirely untouched. The violent imperial punishment sent against it completely disappeared before it could ever arrive. That is the part of the story that feels almost written by the clever oracle itself. The furious king sends absolute military power blindly into a region of absolute emptiness. The deep emptiness simply sends absolutely nothing back. That is a perfect legend. Almost too perfect. The oracle survives, the invader vanishes, and the desert looks like divine security. But perfect legends can form around real disasters. Bias is not a delete key, it is a warning label. The second terrifying part of the legend is that the geological mechanism actually works perfectly. A seasonal Khamsin is not a Hollywood special effect. It is a very real killer. It is a heavy desert wind, incredibly hot, loaded with static dust, and violently disorienting. Visibility instantly collapses until the physical world becomes dark brown pressure violently grinding against your face. Sand gets violently packed into the mouth. Blinding sand grinds directly into the eyes. Sand gets into leather straps, open wounds, armor joints, supply packs, and struggling human lungs. You cannot command a tight military formation when men cannot physically see their own hands. And if the massive storm drops enough heavy sand, it does not have to kill everyone at once. It can scatter the entire column, completely bury supplies, hide the wells, and erase tracks. The massive army becomes isolated pieces. Those terrified pieces become desperate search parties. The search parties eventually become bleached bones, and the buried bones become local rumor. But the desert does something else that deeply matters for the historical record. It edits. A traditional battlefield leaves distinct angles, abandoned camps, heavy metal concentrations, bodies, and cultural memories. The deep desert can completely separate and systematically bury all of that evidence forever. The exact place where the forensic evidence died may not look like a place anymore. The sandstorm theory is scary because it does not require magic. It requires bad timing, bad terrain, and one wall of weather. The unresolved part is whether that mechanism killed them or whether the legend grabbed the most cinematic weapon after the bodies were gone. There are certainly other highly debated forensic possibilities for what happened to the men. Maybe the local guides maliciously failed and the massive column split into the dead ends. Each historical answer solves one distinct logistical problem, but instantly opens another massive contradiction. A completely lost military column should still leave massive archaeological traces behind in the canyons. A violent mutiny should leave compelling stories and exhausted survivors eventually walking back to the oasis. You don't mutiny in the deep Sahara. You mutiny where there is water. Scattering into the open desert is instant guaranteed suicide. The mutiny theory completely fails the geography test. A massive sand burial should leave a permanent physical place, a 50,000-man grave. But the brutal desert keeps stubbornly refusing to provide historians with the satisfying part. Every single theory confidently reaches out for the hard evidence. Every single theory eventually comes back holding nothing but empty sand. Then, in 2009, the quiet stories seemed to suddenly and violently blink. Two Italian explorers enthusiastically announced a spectacular archaeological find that commanded intense global news headlines. They presented human remains, corroded bronze weapons, and ancient jewelry to the eager cameras. These objects were found heavily scattered and heavily bleached in the deep western desert. For a brief, exciting moment, the oldest blank space in the historical record looked like it finally had solid edges. International headlines leaned incredibly forward. The legendary lost army of Cambyses had finally been found. At least, that was the incredibly powerful temptation for the media and the public. The harsh problem is that professional field archaeology does not end at a dramatic announcement. The hard scientific work begins right there. Where is the strictly controlled excavation? Where is the fully peer-reviewed scholarly report? Where are the carbon-dated remains, the secured context, and the independently verified chain of custody? Without that exact data, bleached bones lying in a desert are absolutely not an army. A chunk of corroded bronze in the sand is not definitive proof of King Cambyses. A highly dramatic and evocative geographic location is absolutely not a scientifically solved case. This is exactly where the ancient mystery gets significantly crueler for modern historians. The story gives us just enough physical material to desperately want the discovery to be true. It provides the exact visual shape a missing army should leave behind in our imagination. But human imagination is not historical context. Context is the difference between hard evidence and bait. This is where history channels get themselves arrested by common sense. If you cannot authenticate remains, date artifacts, and publish the dig properly, you do not have the lost army. You have a headline wearing hiking boots. That is exactly why this agonizing historical story still works after 25 centuries. Not because every single part of the legend is physically confirmed, because every answer has teeth. If Herodotus exaggerated, the legend tells us exactly how ancient empires process a brutal humiliation. If the sandstorm really happened, the desert destroyed a massive army without ever needing a battlefield. And if the army is still out there, the truth is almost too unbearable. Somewhere under moving dunes may be helmets, bones, and the last sentence of an imperial order. A terrifyingly massive military command quietly and slowly dissolving directly into the local geology. The oracle at Siwa remains standing. Cambyses never got his bloody answer. His arrogant command confidently entered the deep desert. The deep desert answered in absolute, total silence. Somewhere west of the Nile, the heavy sand is still constantly moving. It does not care what ancient kings wanted. It does not care what modern historians need. It only keeps what it can cover. And for 25 centuries, it has flawlessly covered this. That's the part that gets me. Empires keep records. Deserts keep secrets. And somewhere out there, if Herodotus was even half right, 50,000 men became one of them. I'm Mason. This is Mason Zero.